Good morning, folks. Thank you for being here. We're going to get started. We have a really unique opportunity today, 80 years to the day, to be able to talk about the operational history of the Spitfire, since it was 80 years ago today in 1938 that the first Spitfire went operational with a squadron in the RAF. So thanks very much for taking time out of your day to join us. So here we go, operational history. I've tried to get some period photographs and identify them with some little mnemonics there down on the bottom. So there's some Mark 5s in Tunisia in 43. So again, repeating a little bit, but on this day in 1938, the Spitfire, the first Mark I, joined 19 Squadron at Duxford and went operational. So we're 80 years to the day, and therefore we're going to talk a little bit about the operational history of this remarkable airplane. For starters here, some basics on the airplane. The only British fighter that was manufactured both or all before, during, and after World War II. Okay, it achieved its legendary status during the Battle of Britain. But after that, there was plenty more war to be fought and plenty more theaters to fight in. And the Spitfire showed an amazing initial design and was able to evolve into different roles, more powerful engines. So the initial design stood more than the test of time. Okay, it also pioneered the pretty high threat, but valuable. We didn't have satellites in 1940, did we? So the unarmed photo reconnaissance mission. Early service. I think I've mentioned enough. This day, 1938, a sister airplane. This old Mark I right here, a sister airplane, arrived at Duxford and went operational. Okay, and at the time, the different manufacturers, Supermarine, which was a subsidiary of Vickers, was producing about one of these a week. It did not have, it's an interesting dichotomy. This remarkable, legendary airplane got its start with friendly fire. So this Battle of Barking Creek in the southeast part of the country, they jumped, two Spitfires jumped a couple Hurricanes and shot them both down. And one of the Hurricane pilots was a fatality, and he was the first RAF pilot fatality of World War II at the hands of the brand new Spitfire. So not a good start, but the Spitfire recovered pretty well, as we'll see. The first official combat engagement was a little bit later, about a month later, but notice that this is a good 9+ months before the official start of the Battle of Britain. There were still German bombers up on the north part of the island, the United Kingdom, and some Spitfires jumped some Ju-88s and did some good work up there. Here's a bigger picture. Note a couple things on this early Mark I. It's got a 2-bladed propeller, and it has non-retractable tail wheel. So early start to the Mark I's. You can see 19 Squadron. Okay, so as the war kicks off, in early May of 40, the Wehrmacht invades Western Europe, and from the Western European side of things, the fight's on. Well, almost immediately, Spitfires are flying across the channel and escorting some of their British bombers, RAF bombers, and they get to tangle with some Stukas, and they do some good work on the Stukas, but they get jumped by the airplane that's going to kind of be their nemesis for the next year plus, and those are the early BF-109s, the Emils, the Echoes. And that didn't go very well for the Spitfire. So there, you can see they're starting to learn. And what this is the first real encounter of the new British Spitfire, the fighter, with the new German fighter. And the 109s were able to knock down some Spitfires. Okay, at the end of that month, things are getting better, and over the Calais area, now they have the first recorded shoot down, Spitfire shooting down a 109. And in the period of time between the German invasion and the evacuation at Dunkirk, about 70 Spitfires were lost to all causes, most of those in supporting the evacuation over Dunkirk. So they would have been lost to some ground attack, but most of them to German fighters. And then, from what I've seen historically, or historians consider the 10th of July through the end of October as the official dates of the Battle of Britain. And it was the first major test of two things. First, the Spitfire. The Spitfire's gotten bloodied. The Spitfire has drawn some blood, but the first major test of the Spitfire as far as a mass-produced airplane and an airplane that's part of a larger warfighting organization is the Battle of Britain. And that warfighting organization, Fighter Command, also was cutting its teeth here at the start of the Battle of Britain. So a couple weaknesses showed up pretty early, weaknesses to the Spitfire, that is. First, if we back up a little bit to the planning for the Spitfire and the planning for Fighter Command, they did not expect enemy fighters over England. They expected bombers, enemy bombers, not enemy fighters. They did not foresee a German invasion and the Luftwaffe being able to base on the northern part of France. So they designed their airplanes, they designed their tactics against bombers. And one of the first things that came to light was the dispersion of their firepower. I'm not going to talk too much about the design of the Spitfire. We're going to talk about its operational history. But one of those design features was a very thin wing. So they had to kind of disperse within the wing the machine guns. Decision was made. They had 8 .303 caliber machine guns, and because they were expecting to be attacking bombers, they had a 400-yard range where they wanted a shotgun pattern. So we're going to spray a lot of bullets out. We're not going to harmonize those trajectories. We're going to do a shotgun spray out because we're going to be fighting against larger bombers. Okay, there's the spray. They very quickly said, that ain't working against a BF-109. So the smarter guys got back and said, let's harmonize. And by harmonizing, they mean you're going to pick a range out in front of you. You can see they picked 250 yards, and we're going to sight in all 8 machine guns to try and pinpoint 250 yards in front of me, right under my sight. Okay, weakness number 2 in the early Mark 1s and Mark 2s, and those were the airplanes that would have fought the Battle of Britain, were the Mark 1s and 2s, was the actual .303 caliber itself. A lot of the German airplanes were able to sustain damage, but not any critical damage, and they were able to fly back across the channel and land and get repaired, which means they could fight tomorrow. For the Mark IIBs, here's where they start introducing the different wings, when the primary difference in all the different wings, A, B, C, and an E, echo wing, were the firepower, the machine guns and the cannons inside. Well, for the 2Bs, they put in a 20 millimeter because they needed that knockdown power. But at the time, we're talking mid-1940s, the 20 millimeters they had were very unreliable. So they went back to the 303s. And in the main slugfest there in August, September, and October, they lost almost 260 Spitfires to enemy action. Primary adversary that I've already touched upon, the BF-109, would have been the E model. They called it the Emile. And a couple things that not necessarily really show up well in this photograph or this pictogram, but the E models had this strut, the bracing strut, underneath the horizontal tail. They also had, with their inverted V12 engine, the Daimler Benz, the carburetor air scoop on the left side there was more square than round. So if you see a Messerschmitt 109 that's got a square scoop and the bracing on the back, that's an E model, and that's what would have been fighting the Spitfires during the Battle of Britain time. The main advantage the Spitfires had over the BF was maneuverability. And when you're talking a 1v1 fight, there are two factors. There's turn rate and there's turn radius. So think about a dinner plate. That's your radius. The smaller the turn radius, typically the better. But the other facet of that is the turn rate. So how fast can I fly around this circle? If I'm walking around it, that's not a good thing. So a fighter wants to have a small turn radius and a fast turn rate, so I can go around that circle rapidly. Well, in those two situations, the Spitfire was better than the BF-109. There's also a weakness in the BF's wing. Little known fact, but because of the weak wing that was designed into this, the landing gear of a BF is actually affixed to the fuselage, not the wing, because the wing was not strong enough to support that structural need. And that kind of led the pilots, the German pilots, as they got more and more familiar with and used to the 109, they were a little tentative when they got up to the higher G limits because they were worried about their wings. And if you're worried about the structural integrity of your airplane, you're going to be a little tender, if you will, where the Spitfire pilots did not have that. So that's an advantage. But overall, very closely matched, very closely matched. Initial tactics. Let's go back a couple slides. The initial tactics of the Spitfires were aimed at what? Fighting bombers. Less maneuverable, kind of sitting ducks, if you will. Big panic up here as I mash the microphone. Got a 109 coming in on me. So big shotgun pattern. Let's keep our airplanes close together to increase that firepower. Well, against the 109s, how do you think that went? Okay, so a tight three-ship Vic of the pilots in here. Imagine you're in a three-ship in the weather. You're on your flight lead in the weather. That's how you're going to go to combat in that kind of formation. Really poor maneuverability, really poor visual lookout, really tough on the wingmen. Okay, they also, because of this bomber mentality, bomber threat, they open fire at range. So early on, they're spraying these bullets out here way far away from the fighters, and they're not hitting anything. Okay, the Luftwaffe, and on the other hand, early in the fight, they had a 2 or a 4 ship. They normally fought in a 4 ship, very widely spread, where you would have 1 and 3 kind of together, upwards of a half mile apart, and then 2 and 4 in a fluid position behind them, allowing those wingmen lots of opportunity to visually search, to maneuver if their flight lead was going to dive on a Spitfire, much more maneuverable, much more aggressive, and much more effective. And the Spitfire, the Messerschmitts also had the Civil War in Spain to hone their skills. So those fighting area tactics were immediately obsolete. And this is a South African, Sailor Malan, who was instrumental. He was fighting in a Spitfire for the RAF, and he was instrumental in saying, guys, this ain't hacking it, and coming up with much more maneuverable, fluid formations for which to engage the enemy. Because RAF fairly rapidly kind of adopted a overall philosophy and a tactic of, let's send the Hurricanes after the bombers, and we're going to send the Spitfires after the escorting fighters. Some of the other airplanes that the Spitfire would have encountered, the Luftwaffe also had a large twin-engine fighter. It was considered a fighter, the Bf-110. Okay, long-range destroyer is kind of the philosophy of the Luftwaffe in developing it. It had very heavy firepower. If you can look at the nose of that thing, it kind of harkens almost to like the P-38 with all this firepower, lots of firepower right in the nose, which means it's easy to aim. A lot of firepower right up front. But it maneuvered a lot like the bombers it was escorting. So it was in no way a match for the maneuverable Spitfire. And it suffered pretty greatly, and so was withdrawn from the middle and later stages of the Battle of Britain. Then you've got your bombers. The Henkel 111, I think of all the photos I see of the Battle of Britain, that's probably the one I see the most in those photos. Well, it was 100 plus miles an hour slower than the Spitfire. Pretty rugged, but way too slow and easy prey. The Dornier 17 over here was also relatively slow, but that was the only radial engine of these four bombers, and it was very rugged, so it was hard to knock down. There was a factoid about the Battle of Britain. When you talk about the 8 machine guns, it was taking 4,500 rounds of 303 to bring down one bomber. That's 2 airplanes. That's 2 full loads of ammunition in an 8 machine gun airplane, 2 of them to bring down one bomber. Hence with, hey, the 303s aren't doing much for us, guys. We talked a little bit about, it was over the continent, but where the Spitfires first escorted bombers over France and ran into the Stukas, well, the Luftwaffe sent Stukas across the channel to attack England, and they got slaughtered by the Spitfires, and so they were, like the Bf-110s, they were withdrawn. We can't absorb those attrition rates. And I would say the bottom one, the Junkers 88, it was probably the most effective. It was relatively fast. It was almost as fast as the Spitfire, especially low altitude once it had released its bombs. So a Spitfire rolling in behind it, if it wasn't in range, it was going to take a long time to get into range. So it was pretty fast, and it was pretty maneuverable as well. So in October, that's where most historians say the end of September is kind of the end of the Battle of Britain. That's where the Germans decided, hey, let's change our strategy of focusing on the RAF, and we're going to start bombing London and the cities. And so the Blitz happens. It's a strategy shift. It gives the RAF some breathing room to reman, re-equip, and be ready for the long haul. Okay, so the outcome, it was the first major German defeat of the war because the Luftwaffe did not achieve the air superiority over the Channel or over England that it needed to execute Operation Sea Lion, which was the seaborne invasion of England. So they had to cancel it. The attrition statistics vary kind of greatly from historian to historian, how many Spitfires, how many Messerschmitts, how many bombers were shot down. What is fairly common, though, is the overclaims, almost 3-to-1. The fighter pilots were claiming more than actually were shot down. Really shocking that a fighter pilot would be so brazenly off the mark. Another big impact of this was what I saw termed the Spitfire Fund. So the Minister of Aircraft Production, Lord Beaverbrook, had a plan. So they canvassed the countryside, and if it wasn't a Spitfire smoking whole, if it was a pilot who was able to belly in, they picked that thing up and they took it back and they repaired it and they put it back on the line. So there were a fair number of Spitfires that were shot down, but resurrected, restored, repaired to fight another day. Okay, Battle of Britain, I think we've all heard Churchill's quote about the few, so much owed by so many to so few. And it really put the Spitfire on the path towards immortality, which is right on the front of your program, 80 years of immortal. Okay, so now Battle of Britain is considered over. We still have Spitfires. Well, that's all they can be, is on island in England, so they're doing defense. But now the philosophy, the strategy, changes to let's lean forward and let's go into France and let's go offensive. Well, that led to a reversal, a massive reversal, that the Spitfire pilots met immediately. What did the Messerschmitts have to do to attack England? These short-range, small fighters cross the channel. Okay, I've read where a Bf-109 typically had about 10, maybe 15 minutes of fighting time over England. Well, what are the Spitfires now facing? The exact same thing. And sometimes it can be difficult when you get the red fuel low light on to disengage from a fight. It's not like you can just snap your finger and, okay, I gotta go. You may have to fight your way out of there. So the Spitfire pilots ran into the same thing, and that is a tactical disadvantage. Two primary missions. The British called it a rhubarb, which was a fighter sweep. Let's send our fighters in. Let's go low altitude. Let's strafe German airfields. Let's bring the Luftwaffe up to engage them in air-to-air. They also did what they called a circus, which was a bomber escort mission, similar to like what they did in May of '40, escorting Defiance into the battle. By this time, the Luftwaffe, they weren't standing still either, so they had developed the F model, shown here. So it had a more powerful engine. It got rid of the horizontal struts, and it was a higher performing. And then the Spitfire guys started to run into this airplane, which had advantages in all manners that you would talk about or care about over the Spitfire, except for that turn radius. Its turn radius was a little larger, but it could run around that circle compared to the Spitfires. On a relative scale, much slower travel around the Spitfire's turn radius. They also had radar. So like the Brits did in the Battle of Britain, using radar to their advantage to see the gathering and forming German offensive, the Germans had the same thing. It was actually the Germans who invented the radar. They just didn't use it as well during the Battle of Britain. But now, just like the Spitfires crossing the channel, now the German radar is helping the German fighters know what's the size, potentially what's the composition of this RAF attack package, how many bombers, how many fighters, where are they going? And so they could battle manage their forces. The RAF found pretty quickly that at the time, Battle of Britain fought with Mark 1s and Mark 2s. They upgraded pretty quickly to the Mark 5. They found very quickly against these F models and the Focke-Wulf that the Mark 5 was outclassed. So back to the drawing board, let's advance like all nations did rapidly to improve our aircraft. They came up with Mark 9, which had a Merlin 66. So look at that horsepower. The prototype had just over 1,000 horsepower in that Merlin. And so in a short period of time, now they've upped it 70% of horsepower. And the first introduction of the Griffin 5-bladed engine in the Mark 12, similar horsepower, to try and even the score. And they deserve their own slide with some photographs, both powered by Rolls-Royce. Here's a Mark 9 4-bladed Merlin. This is a clipped wing. They started making some other mods to the wings. The LF kind of stands for low altitude flight, so they optimized certain Spitfires for low or high altitude work. And it's got the big 5-bladed Griffin. On to D-Day. So now the offensive that we just talked about has continued, and obviously Spitfires are still in the homeland defending against German attacks. Once we had our foothold on the continent, on France, as soon as the Allies could, here came the fighter airplanes and the medium range and tactical bombers moving onto the continent to be able to follow the front lines. Well, they did, the RAF did retain some of the Spitfires back on island for home defense, and the Mark 14 in particular did a wonderful job against the V1, the flying bombs. About this time, so now we're summer of 44, D-Day plus, 150 octane fuel is coming across the Atlantic from the United States, and that's boosting performance out of the engines and therefore the airplanes. Our experienced Spitfire pilot, Steve Barber, sitting in the crowd. Steve, did this V1 have a fast card when you were up there in formation with them? He failed, okay. The bulk of the Spits were moved across the channel, as I talked about, getting on the beachhead, getting into the either new air bases or kind of repatriated German airplanes. They did the base hopping. As the front moved, so could the fighters. They also adopted, as we're talking mid to late 44, the Allied overall war efforts, doing a pretty good job against the Luftwaffe. So maybe not air superiority, but close. And now you've got other Allied fighters coming into play, the Mustang as an example. So the Spitfires were, I hate to use the word relegated, but kind of they had to re-roll and bring up a fighter bomber role, which is why I've got this photo here. Here's a Mark 9 with bombs on it. So again, showing the remarkable versatility of the design. Now they're putting 1,000 pounds of bombs underneath the wings. They also further improve their tactics. And here's an example of a Fluid 6 that they were flying with regularity once they were on continent. And you can see that's not a welded wingman. So the wingmen are back, they're able to maneuver, they're able to look out, they're able to much more tactically and aggressively support the fight. Near the end of 44, these guys start popping up. So they bring, because the Mark 14s were doing really well and were well equipped to defend against the V1s, a lot of them stayed back on the island. Well, now with this newer threat, a lot of those Mark 14s moved into France and onto the continent to start battling the German jets. The defense of the Reich also, the Spitfires were critical in that. Now the defense of the Reich is actually the German campaign. How are we going to defend our now ever shrinking Reich? So they had their BFs and their Focke-Wulfs doing air defense, and the Spitfires were now going to go offensive into that. They also did bomber escort, and these Mark 14s were found to be superior in all manner, especially in climb rate with this 2,000 plus horsepower engine on it, to the BF 109Gs, which they were fighting at the time. And now we go to the turn of the of 45 and Operation Bodenplot. Who's heard of Operation Bodenplot besides me? John in the back. 3 guys. Okay, that was the Luftwaffe's offensive on the 1st of January, where they got, it was similar, very similar in the air domain perspective from the Battle of the Bulge. Hey, one last, let's see if we can't wrestle control back from this Allied force. So that happened on the 1st of January. Did not go well for the Luftwaffe. And as far as strictly air-to-air, as best I could find, the Spitfires claimed 32 BFs and Focke-Wulfs to the loss of 7 Spitfires in air-to-air. Okay, we talked a little bit about recce, photo recce. It was actually pre-war, a proposal to develop a small, unarmed, light aircraft. It's stripped of whatever it doesn't need, like guns, but put in cameras and extra fuel. Have it designed or be capable of using high speed, high altitude, high rates of climb as its defense. And the Spitfire was ideal for that. So in October of '39, all the way back there, this is an Australian, Sidney Cotton, convinced the RAF to give him 2 Mark 1s, and he cottonized it. So he did what we talked about. He removed the armament. This is a handheld type of camera that they would have loaded onto a photo reconnaissance Spitfire, put a special paint on it, and that increased the Spitfire speed to almost 400 miles an hour. That's a pretty significant increase over what the standard production combat loaded Spitfires were doing. They were much closer to 350. So this was a big increase. November of '39, so that's even before the Battle of Britain, had some success flying out of northern France, getting high altitude reconnaissance. Some of the successes were against those German radars. The Wurzburg, if I'm saying that correctly, radars were instrumental in that initial Spitfire and RAF offensive after the Battle of Britain. The German radars were very effective, and thanks to photo reconnaissance from Spitfires, the RAF was able to mount an offensive against those radars and put them out of action for a bit. Spits were, as you'll see here in the coming slides, ended up being everywhere. So we'll go to Malta, March of '42, Mark 5s. It's very interesting to note, this is the USS Wasp. And based on the Allied footprint at the time, there was no way to get Spitfires to Malta. So the vast majority of them took off from carriers. Kind of a one-way deal. They had no tail hook, but took off carriers once in range to land at Malta. And they were very successful in blunting the German and Italian air attacks against Malta. It was also interesting that it was from Malta that the RAF first loaded bombs on the Spitfire in the Softening of Sicily campaign. Spitfires loaded for bear, taken off out of Malta and attacking Sicily. North Africa, they were employed as both fighters and fighter bombers. And Spitfires were equipped or equipping Army Air Force, United States Army Air Force squadrons. Several fighter groups had Spitfires. Sicily and Italy, the Mark 5s, and then they improved. I'm sorry, that is not a very good photograph to show the difference of what the Mark 8 brought, other than the kind of pointy vertical stabilizer. So they brought Mark 8s in there, which had improved at longer range as we started doing Sicily and then up into the peninsula of Italy. And in North Africa and Malta, over 300 kills claimed by Spitfire pilots. The Soviets, I didn't know this, almost 1,300, similar to our Lend-Lease, almost 1,300 Spitfires given by the British to the Soviets. Started in the spring of '43. That photo is Mark 5s in Iran as they are circumnavigating the Axis areas to get to Russia. Okay, they did initially see some frontline service, but as I kind of point out, the Russians were initially disappointed in the Mark 5. One, to be blunt, they were the rejects. They were the old, worn-out Mark 5s that had done the European offensive and all that stuff. They were slow compared to the BFs and the Focke-Wulfs that the Russians were fighting on the Eastern Front, but they did like their armament. So they politicked, and the majority of these 1,300 were actually the Mark 9s, larger Merlin, better performance, and the Soviets really liked that airplane. Though as the Soviets were continuing to advance their aviation capabilities, their fighters and fighter bombers started doing really well against the Germans, and so the Spitfires kind of went back to what the Spitfire was designed to do, and that's air defense. So they kind of moved to the rear portion to protect against German bomber attacks. Further getting around. Well, obviously the Commonwealth countries of the British Empire, the Canadians, the Australians, the New Zealanders, and even the Royal Indian Air Force, they all flew Spitfires in their combat squadrons. The French actually got one with a spare Merlin, but by the end of the war, there were 7 Free French squadrons that were equipped with Spitfires in Western Europe and the Mediterranean. And the good old US of A, all the way back to the Battle of Britain, there were American pilots flying for the RAF in Spitfires. Those were the Eagle squadrons some of us may have heard about. And then in, I believe it was September of '42, now that the Army Air Force presence in England is ramping up with bombers and our early fighters, those Eagle squadrons got chopped to actually Americans fighting in an American organization, but they kept the Spitfires. And yes, the Luftwaffe had them. So go all the way back to the Battle of Britain and that Spitfire Fund, where a Spitfire in the Battle of Britain bellies in because he gets shot down, but he's in England, and they just scoop him up and patch him up and back into the fight. Well, the Germans did the same thing to a Spitfire that bellied in France or Belgium, and they used them very smartly to help with their new airplanes in developing new dogfighting techniques against all the different marks of Spitfire that they were able to capture and recover. I could find no record of the Luftwaffe using Spitfires in a combat mode. They were all test and evaluation. But some of the well-known Luftwaffe fighter pilots, the great aces, if they had a chance to fly this, they all thought it was an excellent airplane and had very high regard for it once they met it in combat. And now into the Pacific, the big old Pacific, and that's where the Spitfire ran into the Zero. I don't want to sound biased at all, but if you look closely, I am wearing a green Zero shirt. The Zero was a worthy adversary, and anybody who's heard me talk about the Zero, there's another example. All the way through the end of the war, when you talk about turn radius and turn rate, there were no Allied airplanes that could out-turn a zero. The Spitfire was no different. They ran into some trouble, we'll get here, so the Spitfire pilots learned quickly, just like our F4F Wildcat pilots did, don't turn with a zero. Don't do it. So tactics, slash and run. The P-40s, who were early into the South Pacific, did the same thing. Don't turn with these zeros. The Battle of Darwin, though the Battle of Darwin, that's in northern Australia, that was a critical Allied shipping and air ferry route coming from Midway and or the Hawaii through the Tahiti and all, and the northern part of Australia to get further into the Southwest Pacific. Very important shipping and air routes. And the Japanese knew that. So they were, for a year and a half here, starting in early 42, they were attacking Darwin, which was a major harbor. Well, the Spitfires arrived in, what did I say there, February of 43. Both RAF and the Royal Australians, they were flying the Mark V with the Volks. It's hard to see in there. I'm sorry. I could not find you a better photo. A much larger tropical air filter. You see the air filter on the bottom of the nose back there? Enlarge it like 5 times and move it forward. A tropical and sand reducing air filter to protect the engine. That greatly affected performance. They initially had less than stellar results. One, the short legs, if you look at the northern part of Australia and then kind of go north and you hit New Guinea and Port Moresby and over here Timor and then Java, that's a lot of water, much larger than the English Channel. So the short legs of the Spitfire impacted their ability to go out and meet the enemy and do well against the enemy. Also, a couple different things on the combat experience. The Spitfires held their own, as we've talked about, against the Bf-109s and the Focke-Wulfs as the marks increased. So the pilots who flew Spits or P-40s against those airplanes in North Africa or on the continent learned that they could turn with the German adversaries. Well, what do we talk about against the zero? Don't turn. So some of that previous combat experience came back to bite the new Spitfire pilots now flying against the zero. In October of 43, they upgraded to the Mark 8s, which were a better turning, better airplane, but by then the Japanese Navy had the attrition from this campaign, not only here but elsewhere, New Guinea, the Solomons, forced the Japanese to abandon their concern about attacking North Australia. Okay, but now we have China-Burma. Okay, that thing didn't get kicked off until November of 43, where you can see some first Mark 5s rolled in. Shortly thereafter, Mark 8s. They were very successful thwarting what was at the time Japanese offensives. And here are two of the fighters that the Japanese were using. When you got into China-Burma, there weren't any zeros there. They were the other. The Oscar here is the Army, Japanese Army's air-to-air fighter, as was the 44. It looks a lot like a P-47 in a way, doesn't it? Real bulky fuselage. Well, the Spitfires were effective, very effective against these two airplanes, and they were able to achieve air superiority and help thwart those Japanese offensives. By the time 1945 kicked off in the China-Burma theater, now the Allies are going on the offensive, and the Spitfires helped them maintain and gain air supremacy. So at this point now your ground movers don't have to worry about enemy air because your supporting air has wiped them out. Post-war, how we doing? About time for me to be quiet. Well, post-war, the Spitfire remained in service all around the world. You can see a whole bunch. That is nowhere near an exhaustive list of countries who had Spitfires in their active inventory. They were prominent in the Greek Civil War. The Hellenic Air Force was flying Spitfires. The last air-to-air combat for the Spitfire was in the 48 Arab-Israeli. These are Israeli Mark 9s. And it was to my knowledge, the only Spitfire on Spitfire air-to-air, because the Israelis were flying them, as were the Egyptians, and there were RAF pilots flying RAF Spitfires for the Egyptians. So they tangled with the Israelis as well. And then the last British use of the airplane was in July 48, Malan, so that's Indonesia area, but those were dropping bombs. So the Spits were doing ground attack against the Malayan Communist Party. And just amazing for an airplane that went operational in 1938, in the era of jets. They are operational around the world somewhere into the 1960s. Okay, the marks. They were constantly improving. I said I wasn't going to talk about the design, and I'm not really, but more powerful engines, stronger airframes, better armament. The basic design stood the test of time. Over 20,000 of them. You change a wing, you change it, you add a different engine, you put different bombs on it, ordnance on it, and now you have a different mark, kind of like most countries did. There were 24 marks produced. Not all of them went into full-scale production, but it shows an extremely adaptable basic airframe, and there were no noted failures of the basic design all the way through this 20,000 round of production. Uh-oh. Go back. Okay, sorry, a little switch error up here. Somehow here we go. Who's that? This is a test. Steve Barber can't answer this one. That's Mitchell. That's our buddy Reginald Mitchell, designer of the Spitfire. Small round of applause for Reginald Mitchell. Way to go, Reggie. Okay, not meant to be an eye test. I know it is. These are, 9 of the different marks in production. I've highlighted in yellow the Mark 14. So let's just look at a couple things on the wingspan. Up here on the top, the LF. So they did modify some Spitfires. They clipped the wings. Most of what they did for low altitude was they modified the filters on the engine. They also did a high altitude where they added a little bit to the wingtips and put some different changes. I don't know what they were to the engine to optimize high altitude. But if you look at the basics, 3610, 3610, 3610, 3610. So that wing handled everything from the original design. Yep, it got heavier. No duh. Here's the engine. That's a Merlin 3. They're a Merlin 45. Here's where the Griffins come in. Griffin 3, Griffin 65 in this beast. The power, here's something else that shows the basic airframe, right? From 1,000 in the early ones up over, that's a 100% increase in horsepower. Rate of climb, ceiling, all that stuff went up. Combat range we've talked about. That's probably one of the Achilles heels of the airplane, was its short legs. And I'll talk about the different wings here when we do our walk around, but they're the 303s. They went to 20 millimeters once they worked really hard to get them reliable, because the 303s were just not knocking airplanes down, where the 20 millimeter or the 50 caliber would. Okay, Spit operational history. I am now going to turn this over to Ron Fleischman, our unit historian.
I'm going to do a little embellishment on what Lips has said, talk about some things that people don't know about our airplane and Spitfires in general. Although Reginald Mitchell, R.J. Mitchell, had a great hand in designing this thing based on his designs for the Supermarine racer, the seaplane racer, he became sick and died shortly after the first flight. And he was the guy that took over from him, and throughout the entire development from 1935 to about 1948, there was a guy who took Mitchell's ideas and some ideas of his own. And although he was an Englishman, he had the very unimposing name of Joe Smith. So Joe Smith was responsible for a lot of these things. There are, to date, 55 Spitfires left flying in the world. That doesn't include museum pieces that just sit static. 55 flyable versions of the airplane. The Mark 14, which ours is, there's 957 of those were built. We have one of them. Our airplane was built in the Alder Makeston factory in Berkshire, England, and then it was shipped on to a subsidiary factory, a satellite, if you will. So too late for combat in the European theater. So they shipped it off to India, to Karachi, India, in July of 1945. And the day it got there was right around the time the bomb was dropped, so the war was basically over. Couldn't figure what to do with it. We know it sat for the longest time just pushed in a corner somewhere. It was transferred to the Indian Air Force in 1947 officially. Now this picture of this ratty-looking airplane is the earliest picture I could find of the airplane in India. This was in Patna, which was an air base. This is 1977. This is what it looked like before the Orman Haley brothers, two English aircraft collectors, got it, had it shipped back. And they restored it. And they had it for a while. It was restored to flying condition by two gentlemen named Craig Charleston. It was sold to a guy named Keith Wickerton, registered in England as GMXIV. And the next owner was the American, thank goodness, David Price. David Price, those who are familiar with our museum know David Price. He's been very instrumental and very generous in what he's done for our airplanes in this museum. It was assigned to our wing, had an engine problem. The engine had to be set off. And when we got it, our wing has a very interesting, pieces kind of settle where they have to be. At one point, everybody working on this airplane was either born in England or of English parentage or migrated somewhere from the United Kingdom, and they worked on this airplane. The airplane flies very well. The short range is the problem with it. I understand some of our pilots don't like to fly it because of the short range. It's I couldn't get in the airplane. You got to be a little guy to get in the airplane. It flies very well. We've had very few maintenance problems. Those we have that we fixed. We did lose a canopy one time on a takeoff run, and it took longer to fabricate the canopy than it did to get everything squared away with the airplane. So in a nutshell, we've gone from this wreck, or as they call it, a training aid, and you can see the markings on the side. Those look very much like either RAF markings or Indian markings of one point in time or the other. The markings we have on our airplane are what they call Southeast Asian markings. You'll notice it's not the three concentric circles, the red, white, and blue circle. That's because in the haze of combat, the red, white, and blue looks an awful lot like a Japanese zero, the marking, the meatball. So they went to the pale blue and the dark blue. And so that means this airplane could have been flown by the New Zealanders, the Australians, or maybe the Indian Air Force. So we've come a far cry from this to this magnificent machine you see sitting to my left. And it'll fly for you later, and you'll get to appreciate it. And what I might want to add, of all the history that Rob gave us, those of us who watched the war movies on the late night channel, we all know that it was Leslie Howard and David Niven who really developed this airplane. So thank you very much. Thank you for coming.
Some factoids. These are in your program, and a real good reason to get back there and grab one of those programs. The Mark 14, these are Mark 14 factoids. Mark 14 shot down 300 V-1 flying buzz bombs, was able to make 400 miles an hour in level flight with the wingtips removed. A little bit of a teaser for our walk around. All the airplanes had fairly easily, all the Spitfires, fairly easily removable wingtips. They put these on it to maintain the elliptical shape. They left them off clipped for that low altitude, or they put the pointed ones for high altitude. But you could take them off relatively easy and fly the airplane. Okay, first Allied airplane to shoot down a 262. Here's the cockpit. If we were to get Steve up here or Jason, they would say it's different. It's British. Questions for either Ron or myself? Hi, Chief. Good. We just covered everything, didn't we? Okay, we're, yes.
So you were talking about them building basically one Spitfire wing for them. That was their arrangement ability to build it. And what I had read was that I guess the English way of making and manufacturing airplanes was kind of antiquated. It was almost a craft high-speed process. So one of the things that the Americans brought when they started, I think they actually built some of these. Did they build some of these in the U.S.? I mean, one of the things the Americans did when they started building planes was to improve the manufacturing process so you can make them going faster. Is that right?
I haven't heard that the Americans built the Spitfire wing. I have heard that a lot of it was done by hand, and that therefore, similar to the Merlin, when we built the Packard-built Merlin, we were assembly line and machinery and extremely precise specifications, where one part off that American Merlin would fit on that American Merlin, where the same wasn't necessarily true with the British built, because a lot of it was by hand. So there was. Maybe we have some expounding information here.
Well, a little quick side note on the Packard built. My brother, in the 50s, when he first joined the Air National Guard, he was a mechanic in Ontario. They flew Mustangs, and they do an engine change. And in those days, they still had Spitfire engines in the crate from the war, and they had Packard-built Merlins. And they do an engine change. The pilot would fly the airplane, land, and he could tell them if it was a Packard-built Merlin or an English-built Merlin, because the Packard-built ran much smoother and more power because everything fit perfectly.
And so I think you can take that same concept and apply it to the wings. Though I haven't heard that we built Spitfire wings and shipped them to England.
I think I'm probably confusing two stories there.
Yeah. Okay. So, Ron.
Just a quick comment. Lockheed did send some guys over, like you say. They were just aghast at the English build airplanes. In the middle of the day, you had to stop for tea, and dishes were just hideous as far as American production goes. So maybe we didn't build them. I'm sure some people do better than what you're doing now.
Okay, what else? Any other questions? Yes.
Quick comment on the slide. When they went after the buzz bombs, probably the first couple they went after, they shot them. But you're after flying bombs. If you shoot it and it explodes in midair, then you got to fly through all that debris. And that's not really a healthy way to handle your airplane. So leave it to the English to make a sport out of anything. So we developed the fine art of buzz bomb tipping. And contrary to popular belief, you don't have to touch the buzz bomb. You just have to get close to the edge of it and the burble in the air, throw the buzz bomb off. And as it's just a simple guidance system, it's locked. So I suppose there was a decision that had to be made. You had to do this either over some kind of English forest or countryside or over the channel. Because if you tipped it over the city, it's going to land on the city like it's going to anyways.
And still blow up.
Well, there's one last stage to that. Spies everywhere. The Germans figured out what they were doing, is tipping them. So the Germans, as soon as it tipped, it blow up. They put a device on it. As soon as the gyro tumble, it would blow up. So it still knocked down the airplane. So, you know, espionage was big even then.
Okay. You can, for the next event, the PBJ, it's the 1st of September. I know that's the the Labor Day weekend, but mark your calendars there. And then mark your calendars for the Bearcat, the end of October. Okay, thank you very much. 80 years of Spitfire.